The temple bell had not rung in 3 days. The monks moved through the corridors with their heads bowed, their sandals whispering against the worn stone floors. In the mountains of northern Japan, where the pines grew thick and the mist clung to the valleys like a second skin, there was a chamber no one had opened since the autumn equinox. Inside that chamber, behind a door sealed with paper talismans and pine resin, sat a boy of 17 years. He had not moved in 70 days. His breath had become so shallow that even he could no longer hear it. The lacquer bowl before him held only water. The wooden cup beside his knee had been empty for a week. His spine pressed against the cold wall. His hands rested on his thighs in the gesture of eternal meditation. Outside the chamber, the wind carried the scent of cedar and coming snow. The other monks prayed. They chanted. They waited. And in the darkness of that sealed room, the boy felt his body becoming something else. Not alive, not dead. Something between, something holy, something that would last 1,000 years. The candles in the outer hall burned lower. The night deepened, and the boy, whose name had been Kenshin before he took his vows, began the final passage into a silence that would never end. Chapter 1. The Temple in the Pines. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small and still. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever hour the clock shows on your wall, let it fade. Let the present soften at its edges. We are going backward now, into a time when mountains were holy and silence was a language spoken by those who sought to outlive death itself. I hope you will stay with us through this journey, and if this is your first time here in the dark with these old stories, please consider subscribing. There are many more nights ahead, many more whispers from the past. Now, let us drift backward in time to the mountains of northern Japan, to a temple hidden among the pines, and to a boy who would one day choose to die so slowly that death itself would forget to claim him. The village lay in the valley where the river bent and the rice fields stretched in terraced steps toward the foothills. It was a small place, perhaps 60 families, their houses built of wood and thatch, their lives measured by the seasons and the harvest and the offerings they brought to the temple on the mountain. The mountain itself rose in the east, its peak hidden by clouds even in summer, its slopes thick with cedar and pine and the ancient cryptomeria trees that grew nowhere else in the province. The temple had stood there for 300 years. Some said longer. Some said it had been built in the time of the early Buddhist missionaries, when the Dharma first crossed the sea from China and took root in the volcanic soil of Japan. The temple was called Dainichibo, the Hall of the Great Sun, though little sunlight reached it through the canopy of trees. The boy who would become Kenshin was born in the 6th year of the Tenpo Era, in the season when the plum blossoms opened and the last snow melted from the stones. His father was a farmer. His mother wove cloth on a loom in the corner of their single room. He had 2 older sisters and a younger brother, who died before his first winter. The boy was small, quiet, and given to long silences even as a child. He did not play with the other children in the village. He did not laugh easily. His mother worried. His father said nothing. When the boy was 7 years old, a fever swept through the valley. It took 11 people, including his mother and both his sisters. His father survived. The boy survived. But something in the boy had changed. He stopped speaking altogether for a month. When he finally spoke again, it was only to say that he had seen his mother standing in the corner of the room, her face pale, her hands empty, watching him. His father, who had no wife now and no daughters and no strength left to work the fields alone, took the boy to the temple. It was spring. The path up the mountain was narrow and steep, winding through groves of bamboo and over streams that ran cold and clear from the high places. They walked for half a day. The boy did not ask where they were going. He carried a bundle of rice wrapped in cloth. His father carried nothing. When they reached the temple gate, the boy looked up and saw the great wooden pillars, darkened by rain and age, and the roof of heavy tile that curved upward at the corners like the wings of a sleeping bird. A monk stood at the gate. He wore grey robes. His head was shaved. His face was lined and expressionless. The boy's father bowed. He said that his son was quiet and obedient and had nowhere else to go. The monk looked at the boy for a long time. Then he nodded. The boy did not see his father again. The temple was a place of stone and wood and silence. There were 12 monks living there, ranging in age from 20 to 70 years. They rose before dawn. They chanted sutras in the main hall, their voices low and rhythmic, the words in a language the boy did not understand. They ate twice a day, simple meals of rice and pickled vegetables and miso broth. They swept the floors, they tended the garden, they copied sutras onto long scrolls of paper, their brushes moving with perfect practiced strokes. The boy was given a small room in the eastern wing, a space barely large enough for a sleeping mat and a wooden chest. The walls were bare, the floor was cold at night. He could hear the wind moving through the pines and the distant sound of water falling over rocks. He was taught to bow, to kneel, to hold his hands in the gesture of prayer. He was taught to sit in meditation, his legs folded beneath him, his spine straight, his breath slow and even. At first his legs cramped, his back ached. His mind wandered to the valley, to the house where he had lived, to his mother's face in the corner of the room. But the monks did not allow distraction. When his attention wavered, they struck him lightly on the shoulder with a wooden stick. Not in anger, not in punishment, only as a reminder. The body must be disciplined. The mind must be stilled. The self must be emptied until nothing remains but the pure awareness of the Dharma. He was given a new name, Kenshin. It meant sword of truth, or blade of the heart, though the monks did not explain the meaning to him. Names were not important. The self was not important. What mattered was the practice, the endless repetition, the slow erasure of desire, fear, and attachment. The boy accepted this. He had no family now, no home, no future but the one the temple offered. He learned the sutras. He learned to chant. He learned to move through the halls without making a sound, his feet gliding over the wooden floors like a shadow passing over water. The head priest of the temple was a man named Tetsugin. He was 60 years old, thin as a winter branch, his skin the colour of old parchment. He spoke rarely. When he did, his voice was soft and dry, like leaves turning in the wind. He had been at the temple since he was a boy himself. He had never left the mountain. He had taken a vow of silence for 10 years, and even after the vow ended, he spoke only when necessary. The other monks feared him, not because he was cruel, but because he seemed already to have passed beyond the concerns of living men. He ate almost nothing. He slept perhaps 2 hours a night. He spent his days in the inner chapel, seated before a statue of the Buddha, his eyes closed, his body motionless. Kenshin saw Tetsugin only twice in his first year at the temple. The first time was during the spring festival, when the monks processed through the forest to a shrine dedicated to the mountain kami. Tetsugin walked at the front carrying a wooden staff, his face hidden beneath the wide brim of a straw hat. The second time was in winter, when Kenshin fell ill with a fever and lay shivering on his mat, unable to rise for morning prayers. Tetsugin came to his room. He knelt beside the boy. He placed a hand on his forehead. His palm was cool and dry. He said nothing. But the fever broke that night, and the boy woke to find a cup of water and a bowl of rice porridge beside his mat. The years passed. Kenshin grew taller, though he remained thin and small-boned. His hair, which had once been black and thick, was shaved each month with the others. His hands, which had once been soft, became calloused from sweeping and carrying firewood and grinding ink for the sutra copyists. He learned to read. He learned to write. He learned the names of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the realms of existence, the cycle of birth and death and rebirth. He learned that suffering was the nature of life, that desire was the root of suffering, that the self was an illusion, that the only escape from the wheel of samsara was through perfect discipline, perfect meditation, perfect understanding. And he learned, though no one spoke of it openly in those early years, that there was another path, a path taken by only a few, a path that required not the abandonment of the body but its transformation. A path that turned flesh into relic, life into eternity, suffering into proof of the most absolute devotion. The path was called Sokushinbutsu, the practice of becoming a living Buddha. And in the mountains of northern Japan, in temples like Dainichibo, this path was not a legend or a metaphor. It was real. It had been walked before, and it would be walked again. Kenshin was 14 years old when he first heard the word. It was late autumn. The leaves had turned red and gold, and the temple garden was filled with the sound of their falling. He was sweeping the stone path that led to the main hall when he heard two of the older monks speaking in low voices near the well. One of them was called Jokan, a man of 40 with a scar across his left cheek. The other was younger, perhaps 25, named Shinkai. They were talking about Tetsugen, about how little he ate, about how long he meditated, about the tea he drank, brewed from bark gathered deep in the forest. Jokan said that Tetsugen was preparing. Shinkai asked what he was preparing for. Jokan did not answer directly. He only said the word Sokushinbutsu. And then he glanced toward Kenshin, and both monks fell silent. That night, Kenshin could not sleep. He lay on his mat in the darkness, listening to the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. He thought about the word. He thought about Tetsugen's body, so thin it seemed barely more than bone wrapped in skin. He thought about the tea, the bark, the silence. And he thought about his mother, standing in the corner of the room all those years ago, pale and still, watching him. He wondered if she had been real, if she had been a ghost, if there was a difference. The next morning he asked one of the younger monks what Sokushinbutsu meant. The monk looked at him for a long time. Then he told him to ask Tetsugen. Kenshin did not ask. Not then, but the question remained. It grew inside him like a seed planted in dark soil. And over the months and years that followed, as he watched Tetsugen grow thinner and quieter and more remote, as he saw the old priest drink his bitter tea and sit for days without moving, as he learned more of the temple's history and the names of the monks who had come before, the question became something else. Not a question at all, but a calling, a path, a destiny he had not chosen but could not escape. By the time Kenshin was 16, he knew what he would do. He knew what he would become, and though he told no one, though he continued his daily practice with the same discipline and silence he had always shown, something inside him had already begun to change. He was no longer a boy learning to be a monk. He was a monk preparing to become something more, something that would last beyond breath, beyond decay, beyond time itself. The temple in the pines waited, the mountain waited, and Kenshin, who had been given to the Dharma as a child, now gave himself entirely to the path that only the most devoted could walk. Chapter 2, The Doctrine of Flesh and Stone. The lesson came in winter, when the snow lay thick upon the temple roofs, and the paths through the forest were impassable, except by those who knew the old trails. Kenshin was 16 years old. He had been at the temple for 9 years. He knew the rhythm of the days, the sequence of prayers, the weight of silence. But he did not yet know the doctrine, not fully, not as it was taught to those who were deemed ready. The teaching did not come in the main hall where the morning sutras were chanted. It did not come in the garden, where the monks swept leaves and raked gravel into patterns meant to mirror the flow of water. It came in the inner chapel, a small chamber at the back of the temple where only the senior monks were permitted to enter. The walls were bare stone, the floor was earth, packed hard by centuries of footsteps. At the far end of the room, illuminated by a single oil lamp, sat a statue of the Buddha. Not the compassionate Buddha of the outer halls, serene and golden. This one was different, older, carved from blackened wood. The face was gaunt, the ribs visible beneath the skin, the eyes half closed in a gaze that seemed to look inward into some vast and terrible distance. Tetsugen sat before the statue. He did not turn when Kenshin entered. He did not speak. He simply gestured with one hand toward the floor beside him. Kenshin knelt. The stone was cold even through his robes. His breath formed pale clouds in the air. He waited. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant voices. The lamp flame wavered. Shadows bent and twisted on the walls. Tetsugun's face was as still as the statue before him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper, dry and thin, like paper tearing in the dark. He said that the body was a prison, that flesh was suffering, that birth was pain, and life was pain, and death was pain, and even the space between lives, the bardo where souls waited to be reborn, was filled with confusion and longing and fear. He said that the Buddha had taught this truth 2,500 years ago beneath the Bodhi tree, and that every monk who took vows swore to understand this truth, to accept it, to seek liberation from the endless wheel of samsara. But there were many paths to liberation, Tetsugun said. Some walked the path of meditation, some walked the path of scholarship, copying sutras until their hands cramped and their eyes grew dim. Some walked the path of service, caring for the sick, feeding the poor, building temples in distant provinces, and some, a very few, walked the path of transformation, the path that did not seek to escape the body but to perfect it, to make it incorruptible, to turn flesh into relic, life into proof, mortality into a monument that would endure for 1,000 years. Kenshin did not move. He listened. His hands rested on his thighs. His breath was slow and steady. Tetsugun continued. He said that this path was called Sokushinbutsu. The word meant Buddha in this very body. It was not metaphor, it was not symbol, it was literal. A monk who walked this path did not die in the ordinary way. He did not rot. He did not return to the earth as dust and bone. Instead, through years of preparation, through discipline so absolute that it reshaped the body from within, he became a living mummy, a preserved being, a testament to the power of will and faith in the Dharma. Tetsugun said that there were perhaps 30 such monks in all of Japan. Most were in the northern mountains, in temples like this one, hidden from the world. Some had been sitting in their meditation chambers for 200 years, some for 500. Their bodies remained intact, their skin like parchment, their bones visible beneath, their faces calm, serene, untouched by decay. They were not worshipped as gods, they were honoured as proof that the self could be transcended, that suffering could be overcome, that a man could, through absolute devotion, step beyond the boundaries of life and death. The lamp flickered, the shadows moved. Tetsugun turned his head slightly, enough that Kenshin could see his profile against the darkness. The old priest's cheekbones were sharp, his skin stretched tight, his eyes deep set and shadowed. He looked already like a man halfway through the process, already becoming stone. He said that the path was not easy, that most who attempted it failed, that failure meant not transformation but only death, slow and agonizing, without transcendence. He said that the body had to be prepared over years, that poisons had to be introduced gradually, carefully, so that the flesh became inhospitable to the bacteria and insects that consume the dead, that fat had to be burned away until nothing remained but muscle and sinew and bone, that the mind had to be trained to endure suffering beyond imagination, to remain calm and focused even as the body starved and withered and turned inward upon itself. He said that the final stage required complete isolation. A monk preparing for Sokushinbutsu would be sealed in a stone chamber beneath the temple. He would sit in meditation. He would have a bell which he would ring each day to signal that he still lived. He would have a tube for air. He would have nothing else. No food, no water, only the darkness and the silence and the slow, inevitable passage towards something that was neither life nor death, but a state in between, suspended, eternal. Kenshin's throat was dry. He wanted to speak. He wanted to ask how long the process took, how much pain there was, whether the monks who succeeded felt fear in those final days, sealed in the dark, their bodies failing, their breath thinning to nothing. But he did not speak. He only listened. Tetsugun said that the preparation typically lasted 3 years. The first 1,000 days were spent purging the body of all impurities. No rice, no grain, no cooked food, only nuts, seeds, roots, and bark. The diet was called Mokujikigyo, the tree-eating practice. It stripped away fat, muscle, moisture. It turned the body into something closer to wood than flesh. The second stage involved the tea brewed from the bark of the urushi tree, the lacquer tree, whose sap was used to coat bowls and furniture and make them shine like glass. The sap was poisonous. It caused rashes, burns, nausea, vomiting. But when consumed in small measured amounts over months and years, it soaked into the tissues, into the organs, into the very marrow of the bones. It made the body toxic, inhospitable to rot. After 3 years of this preparation, the monk was ready. He would enter the chamber, he would sit, he would meditate. He would ring the bell each morning, and when the bell stopped, the other monks would wait. 3 years, no more, no less, then they would open the chamber. And if the body remained intact, uncorrupted, still seated in the posture of meditation, the monk would be declared a Sokushinbutsu, a living Buddha, a holy relic. Tetsugen paused. The silence stretched long and cold. Kenshin could hear his own heartbeat, slow and steady, like a drum in the distance. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the enormity of what was being offered, what was being asked. Tetsugen said that he himself had begun the preparation, that he had been drinking the tea for 2 years, that his body was already changing, already becoming something other than what it had been. He said that he would enter the chamber in the spring, when the cherry blossoms opened and the mountain streams ran high with snowmelt. He said that he did not expect to fail, that he had meditated on this path for 40 years, that every breath he had taken, every sutra he had chanted, every moment of stillness and discipline and renunciation had been leading toward this single act, this final offering. And then Tetsugen turned. He looked at Kenshin directly. His eyes were pale, almost colourless, like frost on glass. He said that the temple needed new practitioners, that the path could not be allowed to die, that there were fewer and fewer monks willing to attempt it, fewer families willing to send their sons to temples where such things were still practiced. He said that the Kenshin had the discipline, the focus, the emptiness of self that was required. He said that if Kenshin chose this path, he would begin the preparation immediately. He would be guided. He would be taught. He would be given the tea, the diet, the meditations that would reshape his body and mind. He said that it would take 3 years, and at the end of those 3 years, Kenshin would be 17 years old. Still a boy in the eyes of the world. But in the eyes of the Dharma, in the eyes of the Buddha, he would be something far greater. He would be a vessel, monument, a proof of faith that would outlast empires. Kenshin did not answer immediately. He looked at the statue, at the gaunt face and hollow ribs, at the expression of serene detachment. He thought of his mother, standing in the corner of the room, pale and still. He thought of the fever that had taken her. He thought of the path up the mountain 9 years ago, his father walking ahead of him, never looking back. He thought of the temple, the years of silence, the slow erasure of everything he had been before. He thought of what it would mean to continue that erasure, to take it further, to become not a monk but a monument, not a man but a message written in flesh and bone. He bowed his head. He placed his palms together, and in a voice so quiet it was almost lost beneath the wind outside, he said yes. Tetsugen nodded. He said nothing more. He returned his gaze to the statue. Kenshin remained kneeling for a long time, watching the lamp flame, feeling the cold stone beneath him, knowing that he had just agreed to die. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, covertly, over 3 years, until his body became something that could not die at all. When he finally rose and left the inner chapel, the snow was still falling. The temple was dark and silent, and somewhere in the forest, deep among the pines, the urushi trees stood waiting, their bark thick and rough, Their sap poisonous and black, ready to be harvested and brewed into the tea that would begin his transformation. Chapter 3. The 1000-Day Preparation. The diet began the following morning. Kenshin woke before dawn, as he always did, but this time when the monks gathered in the refectory for breakfast, he did not join them. Instead, he was led by one of the senior monks, a man named Akan, to a small storehouse at the edge of the temple grounds. The storehouse was cold, its walls lined with shelves holding jars of dried goods, sacks of grain, bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters. Akan moved through the dim space with practiced efficiency. He gathered a handful of chestnuts, a small bundle of pine nuts, a strip of dried kelp, and several roots that Kenshin did not recognize, pale and twisted like the fingers of something long buried. Akan placed these items in a woven basket and handed it to Kenshin. He said that this would be his food for the day, that he would eat half in the morning and half in the evening, that he would drink only water and tea, that he would consume no rice, no barley, no millet, no beans, no salt, no oil, no cooked vegetables, no fish, no meat, only what came directly from the forest, only what grew without human cultivation, only what the body could barely sustain itself on. Kenshin took the basket. He asked how long this stage would last. Akan said 1,000 days, nearly 3 years. Kenshin nodded. He did not ask what would happen if he could not endure it. He already knew. Failure meant death or abandonment of the path. There was no third option. He returned to his room. He knelt on the floor. He arranged the contents of the basket before him. The chestnuts were small and hard, their shells mottled brown. The pine nuts were pale, almost white, each one no larger than a grain of rice. The kelp was brittle and tasted of salt and deep water. The roots were bitter, fibrous, difficult to chew. He ate slowly. He chewed each bite until it was nearly liquid, until his jaw ached and his teeth felt loose in his gums. When he finished, his stomach was still empty. Not hungry exactly, just empty. A hollow space beneath his ribs that seemed to echo when he breathed. The days that followed were difficult in ways he had not anticipated. Hunger was one thing. He had fasted before, during the retreat seasons, during the periods of intensive meditation. But this was not fasting, this was something else. This was the slow, relentless draining of the body's reserves. The fat melted away first, then the muscle. His arms grew thin, his ribs became visible beneath his robes. His face hollowed. His skin took on a greyish tint, like old paper left too long in the sun. He felt cold all the time, even in summer when the other monks sweated through their afternoon labours. He wrapped himself in extra layers. He sat close to the braziers in the evening. It made no difference. The cold was inside him. It radiated from his bones. His mind changed too. Thoughts came more slowly. Conversations became difficult to follow. Sometimes during the morning sutras, he would lose track of where he was in the chant. The words would blur together. He would open his mouth and nothing would come out. The other monks did not comment. They knew what he was doing. They had seen it before. Some of them looked at him with something like pity. Others looked at him with awe. Tetsugen looked at him with nothing at all. No emotion, no acknowledgement. As if Kenshin had already become what he was meant to become. A thing, a process, a body in transition. The gathering of food became a kind of meditation. Each morning after the first prayers, Kenshin would leave the temple and walk into the forest. He learned to recognize the trees that bore edible nuts, the oaks and chestnuts and beeches. He learned to dig for roots, to identify the ones that would not poison him. Wild yam, burdock, arrowroot. He learned to strip bark from certain trees, to chew it until it softened, to swallow it even though it tasted like dirt and rot. He learned to find mushrooms, though he had to be careful. Some were safe, some caused vomiting, some caused death. He made mistakes. Twice in the first year he ate something that left him retching in the forest. His body convulsing, his vision swimming. Both times he crawled back to the temple. Both times Ikan gave him water and made him rest. Both times the next morning he went back into the forest. The forest itself became a different place. He had walked through it many times over the years, but always as an observer, always separate. Now he was part of it. He moved slowly, carefully, his body too weak for haste. He noticed things he had never noticed before, the way light filtered through the canopy, the way moss grew in patterns on the north sides of stones, the way certain birds called only at certain hours, the way the air smelled different in different seasons, cedar and pine in winter, earth and rot in spring, pollen and green sap in summer, smoke and decay in autumn. He began to feel as if the forest were breathing around him, as if the trees were watching, not with malice, not with kindness, just watching, waiting, knowing that he was becoming like them, slow, silent, rooted in something deeper than soil. By the end of the first year, Kenshin's weight had dropped by nearly a third. His robes hung loose on his frame. His hands looked like the hands of an old man, the veins prominent, the skin thin and papery. His hair, when it grew back between shavings, came in brittle and colourless. His teeth ached. His gums bled when he chewed. He developed sores on his legs that took weeks to heal. He slept poorly, waking often in the night with cramps in his calves and feet. But he did not stop. He did not complain. He rose each morning. He gathered his food. He ate. He meditated. He chanted. He swept the floors and carried water and performed the tasks assigned to him, though each movement required more effort than it had the day before. The other monks began to avoid him, not out of cruelty, out of respect, or perhaps out of fear. He was becoming something they did not understand, something holy and terrible. When he walked through the corridors, they stepped aside. When he entered a room, conversation stopped. He was still Kenshin, still a monk, still part of the temple community. But he was also something else now, something that existed in a space between the living and the dead, a ghost walking among them, a relic in the making. In the second year, the tea began. Akan came to his room one evening carrying a small lacquered box. Inside the box were strips of bark, dark and rough, smelling faintly of resin and something sharper, almost chemical. Akan said that this was the bark of the urushi tree, that it had been harvested in autumn when the sap was thickest, that it had been dried and stored for 6 months, that Kenshin would brew it each morning, a single strip in a cup of hot water, and drink it before his first meal. Akan said that the tea would make him sick at first, that his stomach would rebel, that he might vomit, might develop rashes, might feel as if his insides were burning, but over time the body would adapt. The poison would become part of him. It would soak into his tissues, his organs, his blood. It would make him inhospitable to the forces of decay. It would preserve him from within. Kenshin took the box. He asked if the tea would kill him. Akan said that it might, that several monks over the centuries had died during this stage, that the line between transformation and death was thin, that there was no way to know in advance whether a body would accept the poison or reject it. Kenshin nodded. He asked nothing else. That night, he boiled water over a small brazier in his room. He placed a strip of bark in a clay cup. He poured the water over it and watched as the liquid turned pale yellow, then amber, then a deep brownish red. The smell was acrid, bitter, like wet leaves and rust. He lifted the cup. He drank. The taste was worse than he had imagined. It coated his tongue, his throat, his teeth. It tasted like rot, like poison, like something that should never be inside a living body. His stomach clenched. Nausea rose in his chest. He set the cup down and waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the pain began. A sharp, twisting agony in his gut, as if something inside him were being wrung out like wet cloth. He doubled over. He pressed his forehead to the cold floor. Sweat broke out on his skin. His vision blurred. He thought he might vomit. He thought he might die right there, alone in his room, his body rejecting the poison before the transformation could even begin. But he did not vomit. He did not die. Slowly, over the course of an hour, the pain subsided. It left behind a dull, throbbing ache that persisted for the rest of the day and into the night. When he finally slept, his dreams were strange and vivid. He dreamed of trees bleeding black sap. He dreamed of his own hands turning to wood. He dreamed of standing in a dark chamber beneath the earth, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but wait. He drank the tea every morning for the next 500 days. Each time the nausea returned. Each time the pain. But gradually it lessened. His body adapted. The tea became routine, a ritual, a sacrament. He began to notice changes. His sweat smelled different, sharper, chemical. His urine was dark, almost black. His skin took on a faint yellowish tint. When he cut his finger on a sharp stone while gathering roots, the blood was slow to flow and dried quickly, leaving a dark, sticky residue. He wondered if this was what it felt like to become something other than human, to be colonized by poison, to be transformed from within into a vessel that could hold eternity. By the end of the 2nd year, Kenshin had stopped menstruating. His body had stopped producing the fluids and functions that marked him as a living organism in the ordinary sense. He was light, hollow, brittle. When he moved, his joints creaked. When he breathed, his chest rattled. He looked at himself in the polished bronze mirror kept in the outer hall for the monks to check their appearance before ceremonies. The face that looked back at him was unrecognizable. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, lips cracked and pale. He looked like a corpse already, like something that had been dead for years but had not yet realized it. He felt a strange sense of peace. He was almost there, almost ready, almost transformed. In the 3rd year, the diet grew even more severe. Eikan instructed him to reduce his intake by half, to eat only every other day, to drink the tea twice daily now, morning and evening. Kenshin obeyed. His body had become so light that he felt as if he might drift away if the wind caught him. He spent most of his time in meditation, sitting, breathing, watching his thoughts arise and dissolve like smoke. He no longer felt hunger in the ordinary sense, only a vast, empty clarity, a stillness so deep it was almost indistinguishable from death. The other monks began to prepare the chamber. He heard them working at night, digging beneath the temple, carving out the space where he would sit. He did not ask to see it. He did not need to. He knew what it would be: stone walls, a stone floor, darkness, and him alone, waiting for the transformation to complete itself. The 1,000 days ended in early spring. The cherry blossoms had just begun to open, their petals pale pink against the grayskull. Kenshin weighed less than half what he had weighed when he began. His body was a collection of bones held together by skin and will. His mind was quiet, clear, ready. Tetsugen came to his room. The old priest looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. He said that the preparation was complete, that the chamber was ready, that in 3 days Kenshin would enter, that he would sit, that he would meditate, that he would ring the bell each morning, and that when the bell stopped, they would wait. 3 years, and then they would open the chamber, and they would see what he had become. Kenshin bowed. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The path had been chosen. The body had been prepared. All that remained was the final passage, the descent into the earth, the long, slow silence, the transformation from flesh into something that could not die. Chapter 4. The Poisoned Earth. The Oroshi tree grew deep in the forest, far from the temple, in a valley where the sunlight came thin and green through the interlocking branches of the old cryptomerius. The monks who harvested the bark went only in autumn, when the sap ran thick and the tree could be wounded without killing it. The tree itself was an object of both reverence and fear. Its sap was the source of the finest lacquer in all of Japan, a substance that could be polished to a mirror sheen, that could preserve wood for centuries, that made objects glow as if lit from within. But the sap was also poison. It blistered skin on contact. It caused rashes that could last for weeks. It made men sick if they breathed its fumes too deeply, and when consumed in small, carefully measured doses over months and years, it soaked into the body like ink into paper, turning the flesh into something that would not rot, that would not decay, that would resist the natural processes of dissolution and return. Kenshin had seen the tree only twice during his 3 years of preparation. The first time, Akan had taken him there in late autumn, when the leaves had turned and the forest floor was thick with fallen needles. They had walked for most of the morning following a trail that was barely visible, a path known only to those who had walked it many times. The tree stood alone in a clearing, massive and ancient, its trunk thick as 3 men standing side by side, its bark dark and deeply furrowed. The branches spread wide, casting a shadow that seemed too heavy, too dense, as if the tree absorbed light rather than reflected it. Akan had told him to stand back. Then the older monk had approached the tree with a small knife and a wooden bucket. He had made a shallow cut in the bark, just deep enough to reach the layer where the sap flowed. The sap had welled up slowly, thick and pale, almost milky. Akan had collected it in the bucket, careful not to let it touch his skin. When he was finished, he had sealed the cut with clay and moss. Then he had turned to Kenshin and told him to remember this place, to remember the tree, because this tree, and others like it scattered through the mountains, were the source of his transformation. Without the sap, without the poison, the body could not be preserved. It would simply die and rot like any other corpse. The urushi tree was the key, the sacred poison, the dark sacrament. The second time Kenshin saw the tree was in the spring of his 3rd year, just weeks before he was to enter the chamber. He had gone alone without permission, walking the trail from memory. He wanted to see it one more time, to stand before it, to understand if he could what it meant to bind his fate to this silent, poisonous thing. The clearing was empty. The tree stood as it always had, indifferent, eternal. Kenshin approached slowly, though. He placed his hand on the bark. It was rough, cold, slightly damp from the morning mist. He closed his eyes. He tried to feel something. Gratitude, fear, connection, but there was nothing. Only the stillness of the forest, only the sound of his own breath. He realized then that the tree did not care whether he succeeded or failed. It did not care whether he lived or died. It was simply itself, a vessel of poison, a tool of transformation, and he was simply a monk who had chosen to drink from it. The tea had changed him in ways he had not anticipated. The physical changes were obvious. His body had become light, hollow, his flesh tight against his bones, his skin taking on the faint yellowish tint that mark those who consume the urushi bark over long periods. But the tea had changed his mind as well. His thoughts had become slower, more deliberate. He found it difficult to hold conversations. Words seemed to arrive in his mouth already half-formed, awkward, insufficient. He preferred silence. He preferred stillness. He spent hours each day in meditation, his breath so slow and shallow that sometimes the other monks would glance at him to make sure he was still alive. He felt as if he were already practicing for the chamber, already learning to exist in a state of minimal function, already becoming something between life and death. The nausea had never entirely disappeared. Even after 2 years of drinking the tea, his stomach would clench each morning when he brought the cup to his lips. The taste had not improved. It was bitter, acrid, metallic, like drinking rust dissolved in water. But he no longer vomited. He no longer doubled over in pain. His body had adapted. It had learned to tolerate the poison, to absorb it, to incorporate it into the structure of his cells and tissues. Akan had explained the process to him once, though Kenshin understood it only in the vaguest terms. The urushi sap contained compounds that were toxic to the bacteria and insects that fed on dead flesh. When these compounds saturated the body, they made it inhospitable to decay. The body became, in effect, self-preserving, a kind of living lacquer, a vessel coated from within. But there were risks. Akan had been clear about this. Too much of the poison could kill. The liver and kidneys could fail, the heart could stop, the brain could swell. Several monks in the temple's history had died during this stage, their bodies unable to process the toxins, their organs shutting down one by one. Their deaths had been slow and agonizing. They had not achieved Sokushinbutsu. They had simply died. Their bodies had been cremated, their names had been recorded, but they had not been venerated. Failure was not transformation. It was only failure. Kenshin thought about this often, especially in the early months when the pain was worst. He wondered if he would be one of the failures, if his body would give out before the transformation was complete, if he would die alone in his room, poisoned, unredeemed. But he did not stop drinking the tea. He drank it every morning. He drank it every evening. He let it fill him, change him, make him into something other than what he had been. The process was not unique to this temple. Akan had told him that there were perhaps a dozen temples in the northern mountains, where the practice of Sokushinbutsu was still maintained. Each temple had its own methods, its own variations. Some monks drank tea made from different plants. Some ate only certain types of bark or roots. Some added minerals to their diet, consuming small amounts of arsenic or mercury to further poison their flesh. The goal was always the same, to make the body inhospitable to decay, to turn it into a relic while it was still alive. But the methods varied, and the success rate was low. Akan estimated that perhaps 1 in 10 monks who attempted the practice succeeded. The others died, or they failed to mummify properly, their bodies rotting despite the preparation. Or they went mad in the chamber, losing their minds in the isolation and darkness. The path was narrow, the margin for error was non-existent, and yet monks continued to attempt it. They continued to drink the poison, to starve themselves, to seal themselves in stone chambers beneath the earth, because the reward, if they succeeded, was immortality, not in the sense of living forever, but in the sense of becoming proof that the self could be transcended, proof that the body could be transformed, proof that faith, discipline, and suffering could overcome the most fundamental law of nature, the law of decay. Kenshin had asked Akan once whether the monks in the chamber suffered, whether they felt pain in those final days, sealed in darkness, their bodies failing, their breath thinning to nothing. Akan had not answered directly. He had only said that pain was irrelevant, that the mind, if properly trained, could detach from pain, that suffering was only suffering if one identified with it, clung to it, allowed it to define the self. A monk who had truly emptied himself of ego, of attachment, of desire, would not experience pain in the ordinary sense. He would simply observe it, note it, let it pass through him like water through a sieve. Kenshin had not been comforted by this answer. He suspected that Akan did not know, that no one knew, that the monks who succeeded in becoming Sokushinbutsu took that knowledge with them into the silence, and those who failed were dead. In the final weeks before he entered the chamber, Kenshin's diet was reduced to almost nothing. He ate once every 3 days, a handful of pine nuts, a strip of dried kelp, a single root, barely enough to keep his body functioning. He drank only the tea and water. His weight dropped further. He could feel his heart beating slowly in his chest, a faint, irregular rhythm, as if it were considering whether to continue. His vision blurred at the edges. He moved slowly, carefully, like an old man. He spent most of his time in his room sitting in a meditation, preparing his mind for what was to come. He thought about the chamber. He thought about the bell. He thought about the darkness. He thought about the 3 years he would spend there if he lived that long, his body slowly transforming, slowly hardening, slowly becoming stone. He thought about his mother. He had not thought about her in years. But now, as the final days approached, her image returned to him, her face pale in the corner of the room, her hands empty, her eyes watching him. He wondered if she had been a ghost, if she had been real, if there was a difference. He wondered if he would see her again, in the chamber, in the darkness, when his mind began to slip and the boundaries between life and death grew thin. He wondered if she would be waiting for him, or if there would be nothing, only silence, only the slow, inevitable cessation of breath and thought and self. The urushi tree stood in the forest, indifferent and eternal. Its sap continued to flow, its bark continued to poison. It had been there for centuries, it would be there for centuries more, and somewhere in the northern mountains of Japan, in a dozen temples hidden among the pines, other monks were drinking the same tea, eating the same diet, preparing the same transformation. Some would succeed, some would fail, but all of them, every single one, would drink from the urushi tree, would let its poison fill them, would become vessels of dark lacquer and silent devotion, would walk the path that Kenshin was walking now, the path that led down into the earth, into the stone chamber, into the long, slow silence where the body forgot how to die. Chapter 5. The Narrowing World. The world grew smaller as Kenshin's body diminished. It was not a metaphor. It was literal. The temple corridors seemed longer. The garden seemed wider. The distance from his room to the main hall, a walk he had made thousands of times over 9 years, now required rest halfway through. He would stop at one of the wooden pillars that lined the covered walkway, lean against it, wait for his breath to steady, then continue. The other monks noticed. They said nothing. They moved around him like water around a stone, silent and careful, as if he were already a relic, already something too fragile to touch. His legs had grown so thin that his robes caught on the bones of his knees when he walked. His arms hung from his shoulders like sticks wrapped in cloth. When he looked down at his hands, he saw the hands of a skeleton. The veins stood out blue and prominent. The tendons were visible beneath the skin, stretching and contracting with each small movement. His fingers were cold all the time now, even when he held them over the brazier in his room, even when he wrapped them in the sleeves of his robe. The narrowing was not only physical. His awareness had begun to contract as well. He found it difficult to think about more than one thing at a time. Conversations became impossible to follow if they involved more than 2 or 3 exchanges. The sutras he had memorized years ago now arrived in his mind in fragments, incomplete, like messages written on torn paper. He would begin a chant and lose the thread halfway through. He would open his mouth and the words would not come. The other monks did not correct him. They understood. The body was failing. The mind was following. This was part of the process. This was what happened when a monk prepared for Sokushinbutsu. The self dissolved. The boundaries between inner and outer began to blur. The world became a dream, and the dream became the only world. He slept poorly, though sleep itself had become difficult to distinguish from waking. He would lie on his mat in the darkness, his eyes open or closed. It made no difference, and she has drifted in and out of something that was neither rest nor consciousness. Images came to him, unbidden. Memories from childhood, so vivid they seemed more real than the room around him. His mother at the loom, her hands moving in steady rhythm, the shuttle passing back and forth. His sisters laughing in the doorway, the fever that had taken them, the heat and the smell and the silence that followed. And then other images, stranger ones, that he could not place in any memory. A forest of black trees with no leaves, a river running upward into the sky, a figure standing in the distance watching him, its face hidden beneath a hood. He did not know if these were dreams or visions or simply the mind breaking down, generating noise as it prepared to shut off completely. His sense of time had become unreliable. Days passed, or perhaps weeks, he could not be certain. The monks marked the calendar by the phases of the moon and the turning of the seasons, but Kenshin no longer followed these markers. Morning and evening blended together. The light through his window was always the same pale grey, whether it was dawn or dusk or midday. He ate when Aikan brought him food, which seemed to happen at irregular intervals, though perhaps it was only his perception that was irregular. He drank the tea when it was placed before him. He performed the rituals of washing and prayer when his body remembered to do so. But increasingly he felt as if he were watching himself from a distance, observing the actions of someone else, someone who looked like him but was not quite him anymore. The other monks had begun to treat him differently, not with reverence exactly, not yet, but with a kind of cautious attention, as if he were a vessel filled with something precious and volatile. When he entered a room, they would stop what they were doing and bow, not the casual bow of one monk to another, but the deeper bow reserved for senior priests or visiting dignitaries. When he passed them in the corridor, they would press themselves against the wall to give him space. No one touched him. No one spoke to him unless necessary. He had become untouchable, not in the sense of being impure, but in the sense of being sacred. He was no longer part of the ordinary life of the temple. He was something apart, something in transition, something that existed in the space between the living and the dead, and to touch him would be to risk contamination by that liminal state. He understood this. He did not resent it. In truth, he preferred the isolation. Conversation required energy he no longer had. The presence of others was exhausting, their voices too loud, their movements too sudden. He spent most of his time alone in his room, sitting in meditation, or lying on his mat, his body so still that sometimes he would forget it was there. He would drift into a state where there was no body, no room, no temple, no mountain, only awareness, pure and empty and vast. And then something would pull him back, a sound, a sensation, the faint ache in his joints, the slow, laboured beating of his heart. And he would remember. He was still here, still alive, still waiting for the final passage. Tetsugun came to see him one afternoon in early spring. The old priest entered without knocking, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who'd forgotten how to hurry. He knelt beside Kenshin's mat. For a long time neither of them spoke. The room was filled with pale light filtering through the paper screen. Outside, a bird called once, then fell silent. Tetsugun looked at Kenshin, with eyes that seemed to see through him, past the flesh and bone, into whatever lay beneath. Finally the old priest spoke. His voice was soft, dry, barely more than a whisper. He said that Kenshin's body was ready, that the transformation was nearly complete, that in another week, perhaps 2, he would enter the chamber. He said that the chamber had been prepared, that it had been blessed, that the bell had been tested and found to ring clearly, even through the layers of stone and earth. He said that Kenshin should spend the remaining days in meditation, that he should empty his mind of all attachment, all fear, all hope, that he should become nothing. Only then could he become everything. Kenshin nodded. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry and the words would not form. Tetsugun seemed to understand. He reached into his robe and withdrew a small wooden box, lacquered black, its surface smooth and cold. He opened the box. Inside was a strip of white cloth folded carefully. Tetsugun lifted the cloth and placed it in Kenshin's hands. He said that this was the cloth Kenshin would wear in the chamber, that it had been blessed by the abbot, that it would be the only thing covering his body aside from his robes when he sat down to begin the final meditation. He said that the cloth represented purity, the erasure of the self, the surrender of all that was individual and particular in favour of the universal and eternal. Kenshin held the cloth. It was soft, weightless. He pressed it to his face. It smelled faintly of incense, of sandalwood and pine. He closed his eyes. He felt tears gathering at the corners of his lids, though he had not cried in years. He did not know if he was sad or afraid or simply overwhelmed by the enormity of what was about to happen. Tetsugun said nothing. He simply sat with Kenshin, the two of them kneeling in the pale light, the silence between them deeper than any words could reach. When Tetsugun finally rose to leave, he paused at the door. He turned back and looked at Kenshin one last time. He said that he was proud, that Kenshin had shown more discipline, more devotion, more willingness to surrender the self than any monk Tetsugun had known in his 40 years at the temple. He said that Kenshin would succeed, that his body would not rot, that he would become Sokushinbutsu, a living Buddha, a monument to the Dharma. And then he left. The door slid shut. Kenshin was alone again. He sat for a long time holding the white cloth, feeling its softness against his skeletal fingers. He wondered if Tetsugen was right, if he would succeed, or if he would simply die in the chamber, his body failing in the darkness, his transformation incomplete. He did not know. He could not know. All he could do was continue, one breath at a time, one moment at a time, until the moment came to stop breathing altogether. The final week passed in a blur of stillness and silence. Kenshin ate nothing. He drank only water and the tea, which had grown so concentrated that it was almost black, thick and bitter, coating his mouth like puff. His body had stopped producing waste. There was nothing left inside him to expel. He was empty, hollow. A shell? He spent hours each day in the inner chapel, seated before the gaunt Buddha, staring into its half-closed eyes, trying to understand what it had seen, what it knew, what it had become. He felt as if he were dissolving, as if the boundaries of his body were becoming porous, permeable, no longer able to contain whatever it was that constituted his self. He wondered if this was enlightenment, if this emptiness, this dissolution was what the sutras spoke of, or if it was simply starvation, the body eating itself, the mind collapsing inward. He did not know. He suspected no one knew. Not really. Not until they had walked the path all the way to its end. On the final day, the monks gathered in the courtyard. It was dawn. The sky was pale and clear, the air cold and sharp with the scent of early spring. Cherry blossoms had begun to open on the trees that lined the temple walls, their petals pink and fragile, trembling in the faint breeze. Kenshin stood at the center of the courtyard, dressed in his simplest robes, the white cloth draped over his shoulders. He was so thin now that the robes hung on him like fabric on a frame. His face was a skull wrapped in yellowed skin. His eyes were sunken, shadowed, empty. The other monks formed a circle around him. Tetsugen stood at the front, holding a small brass bell. He rang it once. The sound was clear and high, cutting through the morning stillness. Then he began to chant. The other monks joined him, their voices low and rhythmic, the words ancient and incomprehensible, a language that belonged to a time before time. Kenshin listened. He did not join the chant. He had no voice left. He simply stood and listened, and felt the sound moving through him, vibrating in his bones, in the hollow spaces where his organs had once been. When the chant ended, Tetsugen stepped forward. He placed a hand on Kenshin's head. His palm was warm, dry, rough. He said a blessing. He said that Kenshin was ready, that the Dharma would guide him, that he would not fail. Then he stepped back. Two monks came forward, younger men Kenshin did not know well, and gestured for him to follow. He walked slowly across the courtyard, his bare feet cold against the stone. The monks led him to the far corner of the temple grounds, to a small wooden structure that had been built during the winter. It looked like a shrine, but it was not a shrine. It was the entrance to the chamber. The door was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to pass through. Beyond the door, stone steps descended into darkness. Kenshin paused at the threshold. He looked back once at the temple, at the monks standing in the courtyard, at the cherry blossoms trembling in the morning light. Then he stepped forward, into the darkness, into the earth, into the long, slow silence where he would either become eternal or simply cease to exist. Chapter 6. The Final 100 Days. The chamber was smaller than Kenshin had imagined. Perhaps 6 feet in each direction, the walls rough-hewn stone, the floor packed earth. There was no light except for the faint glow that came through the bamboo tube that ran from the ceiling to the surface above. The tube was narrow, no wider than a man's wrist, designed to allow air to enter but nothing else. No light, no rain. No sound from the world above, just air, enough to keep him breathing for a while. The monks had placed a wooden platform in the centre of the chamber, raised slightly above the floor. On the platform was a woven mat. Beside the mat was a small brass bell, identical to the one Tetsugen had rung in the courtyard. A length of rope ran from the bell through the bamboo tube to the surface, where the other end was tied to a wooden post. Each morning Kenshin was to ring the bell. One clear strike, that was all. It would tell the monks above that he still lived, that his heart still beat, that the transformation was continuing. When the bell stopped ringing, they would know, they would mark the date, they would wait 3 years, and then they would open the chamber and see what he had become. Kenshin knelt on the mat. The 2 monks who had led him down the steps stood at the entrance, watching. One of them was Akan. The older monk's face was impassive, but his eyes were wet. He said nothing. He simply bowed. Then he and the other monk turned and climbed the steps. Kenshin heard them moving above, heard the sound of wood scraping against stone as they placed the door over the entrance. He heard the thud of earth being shoveled onto the door, sealing it. He heard their footsteps fading, and then there was silence. Complete. Absolute. The kind of silence that existed only deep underground, where no wind reached, where no living thing moved. Kenshin sat very still. He closed his eyes. He took a slow, shallow breath, and then he began to meditate. The first days were the hardest. His body, despite all the preparation, still clung to life with a desperate, animal insistence. His stomach cramped, though there was nothing in it. His throat burned with thirst, though he had no water. His muscles twitched and spasmed, protesting the stillness, demanding movement. He ignored these sensations. He had been trained for this. He had spent 3 years learning to detach from the body's demands, to observe them without responding, to let them pass through him like clouds across an empty sky. But it was different here, in the darkness, in the silence, with no distraction, no ritual, no other monks to anchor him to the world of the living. Here there was only the body and the mind and the slow, grinding passage of time. He rang the bell each morning, or what he believed was morning. He had no way to tell. The darkness was absolute. He could not see his hand when he held it before his face. He could not see the walls or the ceiling or the floor. He existed in a void. The only sense that remained reliable was touch. He could feel the mat beneath him. He could feel the rope in his hand. He could feel his own body, though it seemed to belong to someone else. He would reach up, find the rope, pull it once. The bell would ring, the sound startlingly loud in the enclosed space, echoing off the stone walls. Then silence again, and he would return to his meditation. He tried to count the days. He tried to mark them somehow in his mind, to create a structure that would keep him oriented, that would prevent him from losing himself completely. But the darkness erased all structure. Time became a single, unbroken expanse. One moment stretching into the next with no beginning and no end. By the 10th day, or what he thought was the 10th day, the hunger had mostly faded. His body had given up asking for food. It had turned inward, consuming whatever reserves remained, breaking down muscle, organ tissue, anything that could be converted into energy. He felt himself shrinking. He felt his skin tightening over his bones, his joints becoming more prominent, his body transforming into something that was more architecture than organism. He wondered how long a body could survive like this, without food, without water. He had drunk nothing since entering the chamber. His mouth was so dry that his tongue had stuck to the roof of his mouth, thick and swollen. His lips had cracked and bled. He could taste the blood, metallic and faint. He thought about water, about rain, about the mountain streams that ran cold and clear through the forest. But the thoughts were distant, abstract, as if they belonged to someone else, as if the part of him that wanted water had already died. The hallucinations began around the 20th day. At first, they were subtle, shadows moving at the edge of his vision, though there was no vision, only darkness. Sounds that were not sounds, a whisper, a footstep, the rustle of fabric. He told himself it was nothing, the mind playing tricks, the brain starved of input, generating its own stimuli to fill the void. But the hallucinations grew stronger, more vivid, more insistent. He saw his mother. She stood in the corner of the chamber, her face pale, her hands empty, exactly as he remembered her from the night he had seen her after the fever. She did not speak, she only watched. He tried to ignore her, he tried to return to his meditation, but she remained, night after night, or day after day. There was no difference. She stood and watched and said nothing. And gradually he stopped being afraid of her. He stopped questioning whether she was real or imagined. She was there. That was all. She was part of the chamber now, part of the darkness, part of him. Other figures appeared. His father, his sisters, monks he had known at the temple, some living, some dead. They stood around him in a circle, silent and still, their faces expressionless. He did not know what they wanted. He did not know if they were spirits or memories or simply phantoms conjured by his failing brain. He rang the bell each morning. He pulled the rope. He heard the clear, bright sound cutting through the darkness, and he knew that he was still alive, still here, still capable of that one simple action. The bell was his anchor, the only thing that connected him to the world above, to the temple, to the monks who waited, to the possibility that this suffering had meaning. By the 40th day, he had stopped thinking in words. Language had become too complex, too demanding. His thoughts, such as they were, arrived as images, sensations, fragments of memory that dissolved as soon as they appeared. He existed in a state of pure awareness, stripped of narrative, stripped of identity. He was not Kenshin anymore. He was not a monk. He was not a boy. He was simply a point of consciousness in the darkness, a small flickering flame that refused to go out. He could feel his heart beating, slow, irregular, a pause between each beat that grew longer and longer until he began to wonder if the next beat would come at all. But it always did. The heart continued. The breath continued, shallow, faint, but continuous. The body, despite everything, would not die. The pain came in waves. Sometimes it was sharp, localized, a burning in his chest or a cramping in his legs. Sometimes it was diffuse, a generalized ache that seemed to radiate from his bones themselves. He observed it. He did not resist it. Resistance would only make it worse. He let it come. He let it peak. He let it pass. And in the spaces between the waves of pain there was something else. A kind of peace. Not happiness. Not contentment. Just peace. The absence of struggle. The absence of desire. The emptiness that the sutras spoke of. He wondered if this was what he had been seeking all along. Not transformation, not immortality, just this stillness, this silence, this profound, unbearable peace. By the 60th day, he could no longer feel his legs. They had gone numb weeks ago, but now even the numbness had faded. They were simply absent. He could not move them. He could not sense them. It was as if they had been amputated, though he knew they were still there, still attached to his body, still part of the structure that held him upright on the mat. His hands were still functional, barely. He could still reach for the rope. He could still pull it. He could still ring the bell. But the movements were slow, laboured, requiring all his concentration. He wondered how much longer he could continue, how many more days he could ring the bell, how many more mornings would pass before his hand failed to find the rope or found it but lacked the strength to pull. He thought about Tetsugen. He wondered if the old priest had succeeded. If Tetsugen had entered his own chamber somewhere else in the temple, had sat in his own darkness, had rung his own bell until the ringing stopped. He wondered if they would be open together. 3 years from now, 2 chambers, 2 bodies, 2 Sokushinbutsu seated in eternal meditation. Or if one of them would fail, or both, he did not know. He could not know. All he could do was continue, breathe, ring the bell, exist, for as long as existence was possible. By the 80th day, his breathing had become so shallow that he could barely detect it. He would inhale a tiny sip of air, and wait, and wait, and wait, and then exhale, the breath leaving his lungs in a slow, almost imperceptible release. The pauses between breaths grew longer, minutes, perhaps hours. He could not tell. Time had lost all meaning. There was only the breath. The bell, the darkness, the gradual fading of everything that had once been him. He thought about death, about what it would feel like, if it would hurt, if there would be a moment of clarity at the end, a final flash of awareness before the darkness became permanent, or if it would simply be a fading, a dimming, like a candle burning down to nothing. He did not fear it. He had moved beyond fear. He had moved beyond everything. He was ready. Whenever it came, however it came, he was ready. On the 95th day, he reached for the rope and could not find it. His hand moved through the darkness, searching, grasping at nothing. Panic rose in his chest, hot and sudden, the first strong emotion he had felt in weeks. He had to ring the bell. That was his only task, his only purpose. Without the bell, the monks would think he was dead. They would seal the chamber permanently. They would never open it. He would be forgotten. His body would rot in the darkness, untransformed, unredeemed. He forced himself to breathe, to calm, to think. He moved his hand more slowly, more carefully, sweeping through the space above him. And then his fingers touched the rope. It was there. It had always been there. He had simply lost his sense of position, his awareness of where his body was in space. He gripped the rope. He pulled. The bell rang, clear and bright, proof of life, proof that he continued. He let go of the rope. He settled back onto the mat, and he waited for the next morning, and the morning after that, however many mornings remained. Chapter 7. The Silence of the Bell. The monks had been listening for the bell every morning since Kenshin entered the chamber. It had become a ritual, as fixed and necessary as the morning prayers. Just after dawn, when the first pale light touched the temple roofs and the mist still clung to the forest, one of the monks would walk to the sealed entrance. He would kneel beside the wooden post where the rope emerged from the ground. He would place his ear close to the rope and wait, and then it would come, a single clear tone muffled by the earth and stone but still audible, still unmistakable. The bell. Proof that Kenshin lived. Proof that the transformation continued. The monk would rise, bow once toward the sealed entrance and return to the temple. He would report to Tetsugen, who waited in the main hall. A single word. Rang. And Tetsugen would nod and make a mark on the calendar scroll that hung on the wall. One more day. 103 days now. Nearly 3.5 months. Longer than most who attempted this stage. Longer than Tetsugen himself had expected, though he showed no surprise. He showed nothing. His face remained as calm and remote as ever, his eyes fixed on something beyond the present moment, beyond the temple, beyond the mountain. The bell rang on the 104th day, and the 105th, and the 106th. Each morning the same clear tone, each morning the same report. Rang. The monks had stopped discussing it. In the early weeks there had been whispered conversations in the corridors, speculation about how long Kenshin would last, whether he would succeed or fail. But the whispers had faded. The monks went about their duties in stents. They swept the floors, they tended the garden, they copied sutras, they performed the rituals that had been performed in this temple for 300 years, and each morning they waited for the bell. It had become the heartbeat of the temple, the proof that something extraordinary was happening beneath their feet, that one of their own was walking the path that only the most devoted could walk. On the 107th day, the monk who went to listen was a young man named Ryushin. He was 19 years old, new to the temple, still learning the routines and rituals. He knelt beside the post. He placed his ear close to the rope. He waited. Dawn had come, the sky clear and cold, the cherry blossoms long since fallen. The new leaves bright green on the branches. Birds called from the forest. Somewhere distant, a stream rushed over stones. Ryushin waited. He counted his breaths, 10, 20, 30. The bell did not ring. He waited longer. He pressed his ear harder against the rope, as if proximity might somehow draw the sound forth. Nothing, only silence. He felt his chest tighten. He told himself to wait, to be patient. Perhaps Kenshin was weaker this morning. Perhaps he needed more time to find the strength to pull the rope. Perhaps the bell would ring any moment. He waited. 50 breaths. 100. The sun rose higher. The shadow shortened. Still nothing. No sound. No vibration in the rope. Only silence. Ryushin rose slowly. His legs were stiff from kneeling. He looked at the sealed entrance, at the mound of earth that covered the door, at the stone post where the rope disappeared into the ground. He did not want to be the one to report this. He did not want to walk back to the temple and say the word that everyone dreaded. But there was no choice. He turned and walked back through the forest, following the narrow path that wound between the cryptomeria trees. His steps were slow, reluctant. He reached the temple. He entered the main hall. Tetsugen sat at the front, his eyes closed, his body motionless. The other monks knelt in rows behind him. They had been waiting. They looked up as Ryushin approached. He knelt before Tetsugen. He bowed. He tried to speak. His throat was tight. His voice came out as a whisper. It did not ring. The words hung in the air. No one moved. No one spoke. Tetsugen opened his eyes. He looked at Ryushin for a long moment. Then he nodded. He said nothing. He simply rose and walked toward the entrance, moving with the same slow, deliberate grace he had always possessed. The other monks followed. They gathered at the sealed entrance, all 12 of them standing in a circle around the mound of earth. Tetsugen knelt beside the post. He placed his hand on the rope. He closed his eyes. He waited. The monks watched. The forest was silent. No wind, no birds, only the faint sound of water in the distance. Minutes passed. Tetsugen remained still, his hand on the rope, his face expressionless. Then he opened his eyes. He let go of the rope. He stood. He looked at the assembled monks. He said that they would wait, that sometimes a monk grew too weak to ring the bell but survived another day or 2 or 3, that they would listen again tomorrow morning. And if the bell did not ring tomorrow, they would listen the day after. They would listen for 7 days, and if the bell did not ring in 7 days, then they would know, then they would mark the date, then they would begin the wait, 3 years, and then they would open the chamber, and they would see. The bell did not ring the next morning, or the morning after. On the 3rd day, Tetsugen himself went to listen. He knelt beside the post. He pressed his ear to the rope. He waited longer than any of the others had. His body so still he might have been meditating. When he finally rose, his face showed nothing. But his eyes, which had always been distant and cold, seemed to hold something new. Not grief, not sadness, but something close to it. A recognition, an acknowledgement. He walked back to the temple alone. He entered the inner chapel. He knelt before the gaunt Buddha, and he sat there for the rest of the day, unmoving, silent, perhaps praying, perhaps simply being present with whatever it was that had passed between him and the boy in the chamber beneath the earth. On the 7th day, the monks gathered again at the sealed entrance. This time they performed a ceremony. Tetsugen burned incense, the smoke rising pale and fragrant into the morning air. He chanted a sutra, the words slow and measured, a prayer for the dead or the dying, or those who existed in the space between. The other monks joined him, their voices low and rhythmic. When the chant ended, Tetsugen approached the mound of earth. He placed a small wooden marker at its edge. On the marker he had written 3 characters, Kenshin, and beneath the name, the date. The 107th day of his meditation. The day the bell had stopped. The day he had either died or passed beyond the need to signal his continued existence. The marker would remain there for 3 years. A reminder, a record, a promise that they would return. The monks returned to the temple. They resumed their routines. But something had changed. The temple felt emptier, quieter. The morning ritual of listening for the bell had given the days a structure, a sense of purpose and expectation. Now that structure was gone. The mornings felt hollow. The monks moved through their tasks with a heaviness that had not been there before. Some of them wept, though they did so in private, in their rooms, where no one could see. Others grew more silent, more withdrawn, as if they were afraid to speak, afraid to acknowledge what had happened. Tetsugen showed no outward change. He continued as he always had, rising before dawn, meditating, chanting, leading the temple with the same calm, implacable authority. But those who knew him well, who had lived alongside him for decades, noticed small things. The way he paused sometimes at the window looking out toward the forest. The way his hands trembled slightly when he lifted his teacup. The way he would sit for hours in the inner chapel staring at the gaunt Buddha as if seeking answers to questions he could not bring himself to ask. Spring turned to summer. The forest grew thick and green. The air grew warm and heavy with humidity. The temple garden filled with the sound of cicadas, their droning chorus rising and falling like breath. The monks worked. They prayed. They waited. The sealed entrance became overgrown with moss and ferns, nature slowly reclaiming the small disturbance that marked Kenshin's passage into the earth. The wooden marker remained visible, though it weathered and darkened over the months. Occasionally one of the monks would walk out to the site, would stand before the marker, would bow. They did not speak to Kenshin. They did not pray for him, not specifically. They simply acknowledged his presence, or his absence, or whatever state he now occupied deep beneath the ground in the darkness of the stone chamber. Summer turned to autumn. The leaves changed colour, red and gold and orange, brilliant against the grey sky. The air grew cold. The first frost came, coating the temple roofs with silver, turning the garden grass brittle and white. Tetsugen grew thinner. He ate almost nothing now, in even less than before. His body had become skeletal, his robes hanging on him like fabric on a frame. The other monks watched him with concern. They knew what he was doing. He was continuing his own preparation, accelerating it. Drinking more of the tea, eating less, meditating longer. He had said he would enter his own chamber in the spring when Kenshin entered. But Kenshin's entry had changed something, had perhaps given Tetsugen a new resolve, a new urgency. He spoke of it to no one, but everyone knew, everyone understood. Tetsugen was preparing to follow, to take the same path, to seal himself in his own chamber, and see if he, like Kenshin, could achieve what so few achieved: transformation, transcendence, immortality in flesh and bone. Winter came. Snow fell thick and heavy, covering the temple, covering the forest, covering the sealed entrance where Kenshin lay beneath the earth. The marker was buried under drifts of white. The rope that ran from the chamber to the surface was frozen, stiff with ice. No one went to visit anymore. The path was impassable. The monks stayed inside, huddled around braziers, chanting sutras, waiting for spring. Tetsugen sat in the inner chapel, his body wrapped in layers of robes, his breath forming pale clouds in the cold air. He looked at the gaunt Buddha. He looked at his own hands, skeletal and yellow-skinned. He wondered if Kenshin was still alive down there, if the body was preserved, if the transformation was complete. He wondered if he himself would succeed, if his body would accept the poison, if his mind would remain clear in the isolation and darkness. He wondered if anyone would remember them, if the temple would still be here in 3 years, or 30, or 300, if the path they had chosen would endure or be forgotten, like so many other practices, lost to time and changing belief. He did not know. He could not know. All he could do was continue, breathe, prepare, wait for spring, and when the spring came, enter the chamber. Sit, meditate, ring the bell, until the bell stopped, until the silence came, until the transformation was complete or death claimed him. One or the other. There was no third option. There never had been. To 8, the unearthing. 3 years passed like water moving beneath ice, slow, silent, invisible to those who did not know to look for it. The temple continued its rhythms. The monks rose before dawn, they chanted sutras, they swept floors, they tended the garden. They copied scriptures onto long scrolls of paper, their brushes moving with practiced precision. Some monks left, some arrived. The abbot grew older. Tetsugen had entered his own chamber 6 months after Kenshin, in the autumn when the leaves turned. His bell had rung for 93 days, then it too had stopped. Now there were 2 sealed chambers, 2 wooden markers, 2 bodies waiting beneath the earth. The temple had become a place of waiting, a place where the living moved quietly above the transforming dead, where the boundary between this world and whatever lay beyond had grown thin as rice paper. The 3 years ended in spring. The cherry blossoms opened, their petals pale pink against the grey morning sky. The date had been marked on the temple calendar for years. Everyone knew. Everyone had been preparing. The abbot, an old man named Kayan who had led the temple for 30 years, announced that they would open Kenshin's chamber first. At dawn, on the 3rd day after the blossoms opened, the monks spent those 3 days in prayer and purification. They fasted, they bathed in cold water, they burned incense. They prepared offerings of rice and tea and flowers. They prepared their minds for what they might find. Success, or failure, a Sokushinbutsu, or a corpse. There was no way to know until the chamber was opened. No way to prepare except through discipline and acceptance. Whatever they found would be what the Dharma had ordained, what karma had shaped, what the boy himself had achieved or failed to achieve through 3 years of unimaginable suffering. The morning came clear and cold. The monks gathered at the sealed entrance just as the sun rose over the mountains. The mound of earth was covered with moss and ferns now, green and thick, nature having claimed the disturbance. The wooden marker was weathered, darkened by rain and sun, but the characters were still visible. Kenshin, and the date, 3 years and 7 days ago. The abbot stood at the front holding a ceremonial shovel, its handle wrapped in white cloth. Behind him stood the other monks, perhaps 20 of them now, some who had known Kenshin, some who had arrived after he entered the chamber and knew him only as a story, a legend, a boy who had chosen to die so slowly that death forgot him. The abbot bowed toward the mound. He spoke a prayer. Then he lifted the shovel and began to dig. The work was slow, careful, reverent. The monks took turns, each one removing a few shovelfuls of earth before passing the tool to the next. They did not speak. The only sounds were the scrape of metal against soil, the soft thud of earth being set aside, the occasional call of a bird from the forest. As they dug deeper, the earth grew harder, more compacted. They had to use picks to break through the layers that had settled and compressed over 3 years. Sweat broke out on their faces despite the cool morning air. Their breath came harder. But they did not hurry. This was sacred work. This was the moment that would determine whether Kenshin's suffering had meaning, whether his sacrifice had achieved transformation, whether the path of Sokushinbutsu was still possible in this era, in this mountain, in this temple that had seen so many attempt and so few succeed. After 2 hours, they reached the wooden door. It was still sealed, the edges packed with clay and resin, exactly as it had been left 3 years ago. The abbot knelt beside it. He brushed away the remaining earth with his hands, revealing the door's surface, dark and weathered. He looked back at the assembled monks. His face was calm, but his eyes held something else. Anticipation, fear, hope, perhaps all three. He said that they would open the door now, that whatever they found, they would accept it with equanimity and grace. That if Kenshin had succeeded, they would honour him. If he had failed, they would still honour him. The attempt itself was worthy of honour. The willingness to walk this path was proof of devotion greater than most would ever know. The monks bowed. They understood. The abbot turned back to the door. He inserted a wooden wedge beneath its edge. He tapped it with a mallet. The seal cracked. Ancient air escaped, musty and cold. The abbot worked the wedge deeper, then inserted another. The door began to lift. 2 monks stepped forward to help. Together they raised the door and set it aside. Darkness yawned beneath. The stone steps descended into blackness, the air that rose from below thick with the smell of earth and stone and something else, something faintly sweet, faintly chemical. The smell of the urushi tea, the smell of preserved flesh. The abbot took a lantern from one of the monks. He lit it. The flame flickered, casting long shadows across the entrance. He descended the steps slowly, one at a time, holding the lantern before him. 2 senior monks followed. The others remained at the surface, waiting. The sound of footsteps echoed in the enclosed space, then stopped. Silence, long and heavy. The monks at the surface held their breath. They could see nothing. They could hear nothing. Only the faint crackle of the lantern flame. Then a voice from below. The abbot's voice. Soft, reverent. A single word. "Come!" The monks descended. One by one, they filed down the narrow steps into the chamber. The space was small, cramped. The ceiling so low they had to bow their heads. The lantern light revealed stone walls, rough and damp, patches of green growth in the corners where moisture had seeped through. And in the centre of the chamber, on the wooden platform, on the woven mat, sat Kenshin, or what had been Kenshin. The body sat in perfect meditation posture, legs folded, spine straight, hands resting on the thighs in the gesture of dhyana mudra. The head was slightly bowed, the chin tucked, the eyes closed. The skin was dark, leathery, stretched tight over the bones. The face was a skull with skin, the cheekbones prominent, the eye sockets deep, the mouth slightly open, revealing yellowed teeth. The body was clothed in the simple robes it had worn 3 years ago, now darkened and stiff. The white cloth draped over the shoulders. The body was small, impossibly small, shrunken to perhaps half its original size, but it was intact, whole, uncorrupted. There was no rot, no decay, no sign that insects or bacteria had touched it. The flesh, such as it was, remained attached to the bones. The body had not collapsed. It sat as it had sat 3 years ago. In the moment, Kenshin had taken his last breath or passed beyond breath into something else. The transformation was complete. He was Sokushinbutsu, a living Buddha, a boy who had become eternal. The monks stood in silence, their faces illuminated by the lantern's glow, their eyes fixed on the figure before them. Some wept, some smiled, some simply stared, overwhelmed by what they were witnessing. The abbot moved forward slowly. He knelt before the body. He placed his palms together and bowed, his forehead touching the cold stone floor. He spoke a sutra, the words barely audible, prayer of gratitude and recognition. When he finished, he rose and gestured for the others to approach. One by one, the monks came forward. They knelt, they bowed. They paid their respects to Kenshin, who was no longer merely Kenshin, but something greater. A relic, a testament, a proof that the path was real, that suffering could be transcended, that the body could be transformed through absolute devotion into something that would endure for centuries. They carried him up the steps with infinite care. 4 monks, each holding a corner of the platform, moving in perfect synchronization, as if they were carrying not a body but a vessel filled with something infinitely precious and fragile. They emerged into the morning light. The sun had risen higher now, its rays cutting through the trees, illuminating the moss and ferns and cherry blossoms. The monks who had waited at the surface gasped when they saw him. Some fell to their knees, others pressed their palms together and bowed. The abbot led the procession back to the temple, walking slowly, the monks following in 2 rows, chanting a sutra, their voices rising and falling in the ancient rhythm. Birds fell silent as they passed. The forest seemed to hold its breath. It was as if nature itself recognized what was being carried through its midst, something that belonged neither to life nor to death, but to some third state that existed beyond both. They brought him to the inner chapel, the small chamber where Kenshin had received the teaching 3 years ago, where Tetsugen had explained the doctrine of flesh and stone, where the journey had truly begun. They placed the platform before the gaunt Buddha, the 2 figures now facing each other. The carved Buddha with its hollow ribs and serene expression, the mummified boy with his leathery skin and closed eyes, mirror images, proof of the same truth. The abbot arranged the offerings, rice, tea, flowers, incense. He lit the incense, and the smoke rose in pale spirals, filling the chamber with the scent of sandalwood and cedar. He said that Kenshin would remain here for now, that they would build a proper shrine for him later, that people would come from distant provinces to see him, to pray before him, to seek his blessing, that his name would be remembered for 1,000 years, that he had achieved what few in all of history had achieved. He had become more than human, more than mortal. He had become a bridge between this world and the next, a reminder that suffering, when embraced with perfect discipline and perfect faith, could become the doorway to the eternal. The monks filed out of the chapel, leaving Kenshin alone with the Buddha. The door slid shut, the temple fell silent, and in that silence, in that darkness broken only by the faint glow of lantern light filtering through the paper screens, the boy who had mummified himself alive sat as he would sit for centuries to come, unchanged, uncorrupted, eternal, his journey complete, his transformation absolute, his suffering transformed into something that would inspire and terrify generations yet unborn. He had walked the path all the way to its end, and he had not failed. Chapter 9. The Boy Who Did Not Rot. The news spread slowly at first, moving from monk to monk, from temple to village, from village to town. In the mountains of northern Japan, at the temple called Dainichibo, a boy had achieved Sokushinbutsu. He had sealed himself in a stone chamber. He had meditated for over 100 days without food or water. He had died, or passed beyond death, and his body had not rotted. 3 years later, when the chamber was opened, he sat exactly as he had sat the day he entered, skin like leather, eyes closed, hands folded, perfect, intact, preserved. The story travelled down the mountain on the lips of pilgrims and merchants. It reached the provincial capital. It reached other temples where monks whispered about it during evening prayers. Some heard the story and dismissed it as legend, as exaggeration, as the kind of tale that grew in the telling until it bore no resemblance to truth. But others heard it and believed, and they came up the mountain, through the forest, to see for themselves. The first visitors arrived within a month of the opening. A merchant from the coast who had heard the story in a tea house. An elderly woman whose grandson was a monk at a temple 2 provinces away. A scholar who studied Buddhist practices and wanted to document what he found. The abbot received them all. He led them to the inner chapel. He allowed them to see Kenshin, though he warned them first. He said that what they were about to witness might disturb them, that the body was not beautiful in any conventional sense, that it was small and dark and shrunken, more like a sculpture carved from ancient wood than anything that had once been human. But the visitors were not deterred. They entered the chapel. They looked upon the mummified boy, and almost without exception they fell to their knees, not because they were told to, not because it was expected, but because something in the sight of that small preserved figure struck them to their core. The absolute stillness of it, the patience of it, the fact that a boy, barely 17 years old, had chosen this path, had endured years of starvation and poisoning and isolation, had sat in darkness until his body forgot how to die. The visitors left offerings, coins, flowers, strips of paper with prayers written in careful characters. They bowed, they wept, they left the temple changed in ways they could not articulate. As the weeks became months, the visitors increased. 10 came, then 20, then 50. The temple, which had existed for 300 years in relative obscurity, known only to the villages in the valley below, became a place of pilgrimage. People travelled for days to see Kenshin, farmers who had never left their rice fields, merchants who had never prayed to anything but the prospect of profit, samurai who had spent their lives perfecting the art of killing. They came from all stations, all walks of life, drawn by the story of the boy who had transcended flesh, who had proven that the Dharma was real, that enlightenment was possible, that death itself could be overcome through discipline and faith. The abbot, overwhelmed by the attention, decided to build a proper shrine. He commissioned carpenters from the nearest town. They constructed a small wooden building adjacent to the main temple, with a raised platform at its center and walls of polished cypress. On the platform they placed a glass case, and inside the case they placed Kenshin. The glass allowed visitors to see him clearly while protecting the body from touch, from moisture, from the oils and bacteria that human contact might introduce. Kenshin sat inside the case exactly as he had sat in the chamber, legs folded, spine straight, hands resting on his thighs. The robes had been replaced with new ones, deep brown, the colour of monks' garments. The white cloth remained draped over his shoulders. His face was visible through this glass, the features still recognisable despite the shrinkage and discoloration. The eyes were closed, the lids slightly sunken. The mouth was closed, the lips pulled tight over the teeth. The skin was the colour of old leather, dark brown with patches of yellow where the urushi tea had concentrated most heavily. The body was small, barely 4 feet tall now, compressed and reduced by the process, but it was whole, unbroken, a miracle of preservation, a testament to the power of will over nature. The shrine was dedicated on a morning in late summer. The abbot performed the ceremony, burning incense and chanting sutras, while dozens of visitors looked on. He spoke about Kenshin's life, about the boy who had come to the temple at age 7, orphaned and silent, about his discipline, his devotion, his willingness to walk the path that few could even imagine. He said that Kenshin was now a bodhisattva, a being who had achieved enlightenment but chose to remain in this world, in this form, to guide and inspire others. He said that prayers offered before Kenshin would be heard, that his presence was a blessing, that the temple and the mountain and all who came here were protected by his sacrifice. The visitors bowed. They offered coins and flowers and prayers, and when they left, they carried the story with them, spreading it further to more distant provinces, to cities Kenshin had never seen, to places where his name would become synonymous with devotion and suffering and transcendence. Over the years, other Sokushinbutsu were discovered. Monks who had attempted the practice at other temples, some successful, some not. The successful ones were enshrined like Kenshin, placed in glass cases, venerated as living Buddhas. But Kenshin remained special, perhaps because he was so young, perhaps because his story was so pure, so free of complication or ambiguity. A boy who had nothing, who became a monk, who chose the hardest path, who succeeded. His shrine became one of the most visited in the northern mountains. People came seeking blessings for sick children, for difficult births, for relief from suffering. They believed that Kenshin, who had endured more suffering than most could imagine, understood their pain, that he would intercede on their behalf, that his preserved body was a channel between this world and the next, a doorway through which prayers could pass and blessings could return. The monks at the temple cared for the shrine with meticulous attention. They cleaned the glass case daily, they changed the offerings, they burned fresh incense each morning. They kept records of the visitors, noting how many came each month, what they prayed for, what offerings they left. The shrine became the temple's primary source of income. The offerings were substantial, enough to repair the aging buildings, to feed the monks, to support the copying of sutras and the maintenance of the garden. The temple, which had once struggled to survive, now thrived, all because of Kenshin. All because a boy had chosen to die in a way that transformed death into something else, into permanence, into proof, into a kind of immortality that had nothing to do with living and everything to do with remaining. But there were questions. Always questions. Visitors would ask the monks how it was possible, how a body could be preserved without rot. The monks would explain the process, the diet, the tea, the poisoning of the flesh from within. Some visitors accepted this explanation. Others remained skeptical. They suggested that the body had been treated after death. that it had been embalmed somehow, that it was not truly a mummification achieved through the monk's own practice, but through external intervention. The monks would shake their heads, they would show the records. The calendar marking the 107 days the bell rang, the testimony of those who had been present at the opening, the absence of any embalming tools or chemicals, the body was what it appeared to be, a self-mummified monk, a boy who had poisoned and starved himself into preservation. But doubt persisted, because the thing was so extraordinary, so impossible, so far beyond the ordinary processes of nature that it seemed to violate the very laws that governed flesh and decay. Scholars came to study Kenshin. They measured the body. They documented its dimensions, its coloration, the condition of the skin and hair and teeth. They took samples, tiny fragments of skin scraped from the back where it would not be visible, and analysed them. They found high concentrations of toxic compounds, urushiol from the lacquer tree, other plant-based poisons. The tissues were saturated with these substances. The scholars published papers. They presented findings at academic gatherings. They confirmed that yes, the preservation was real, that the body had not been embalmed in any conventional sense, that the mummification had been achieved through internal poisoning and dehydration, exactly as the monks claimed. But even with scientific confirmation, the achievement seemed no less miraculous. If anything, understanding the process made it more impressive, more terrible. The suffering required, the discipline, the slow, deliberate transformation of flesh into something that could not rot. It defied comprehension. It inspired awe and horror in equal measure. Decades passed. The wooden shrine weathered and was rebuilt. The glass case was replaced with a better one, more airtight, better sealed against moisture. Kenshin remained unchanged. His body did not decay. It did not crumble. It sat as it had sat on the day the chamber was opened. A century ago now. Then 2 centuries. Then 3. Monks who cared for the shrine grew old and died. New monks arrived. The temple endured wars, famines, changes in government and culture. Japan transformed from a feudal society to an industrialized nation. Electricity came to the mountains, roads were built. The temple, once accessible only by foot, could now be reached by car. But through all these changes, Kenshin endured, sitting, silent, preserved. A bridge to a past that seemed increasingly remote, increasingly impossible. A reminder that once, in this place, there had been monks who believed so deeply in transcendence that they were willing to die for it. Slowly, deliberately, transforming their bodies into monuments that would outlast empires. Chapter 10. The Shrine of the Unbroken Vow. The temple stands today as it has stood for 700 years. The wooden buildings have been repaired and rebuilt countless times, the roofs retiled, the pillars replaced, but the foundation remains. The stone path that winds up the mountain through the Cryptomeria forest is the same path that Kenshin walked as a boy. The stream that runs beside it still flows cold and clear from the high places. The garden is tended by monks who wear the same grey robes, who rise before dawn, who chant the same sutras in the same ancient language. The world beyond the mountain has changed beyond recognition. Cities of glass and steel stretch toward the sky. Machines move people and information at speeds that would seem like magic to anyone from Kenshin's time. But here, in this mountain temple, time moves differently, slower, measured not in seconds or minutes, but in seasons and centuries, in the opening of cherry blossoms, in the falling of leaves, in the slow weathering of stone. The shrine where Kenshin sits is on the eastern side of the temple grounds, a simple wooden structure with a sloped roof and walls of dark cypress. A sign at the entrance explains in Japanese and English what visitors are about to see. It uses words like self-mummification and Sokushinbutsu and ascetic practice. It provides dates. The year Kenshin was born, the year he entered the temple, the year he entered the chamber, the year the chamber was opened. It explains the process, though perhaps no explanation can truly convey what it meant, what it required. The sign is matter of fact, almost clinical, but inside the shrine there is nothing clinical. There is only presence, the weight of centuries, the stillness of a body that has not moved in 700 years. The glass case stands at the centre of the room on a raised wooden platform. The case is climate controlled now, the air inside kept at a constant temperature and humidity to prevent any further degradation. Inside the case, Kenshin sits. He looks much as he did the day the chamber was opened, perhaps slightly darker, perhaps slightly more desiccated, but intact, whole. His robes are old, replaced last perhaps 50 years ago, deep brown and faded, the white cloth over his shoulders, his hands folded in his lap, his face a mask of leather and bone, the features still recognizable if one looks closely. The high cheekbones, the shape of the jaw, the slight curve of the lips. He was 17 when he died, or passed beyond dying. He would be over 700 years old now if years meant anything to him. But they do not. He exists outside of time, suspended, preserved. Neither living nor dead, but something in between. Something that defies the categories humans use to understand existence. Visitors still come, not as many as in the early years when the story was new and miraculous. But they come. Tourists from Tokyo and Osaka who are visiting the region. Foreign travellers who have read about Sokushinbutsu in books or articles and want to see it for themselves. Students of Buddhism, scholars of religious practice, the curious, the devout, the skeptical. They enter the shrine and stand before the glass case and look at Kenshin. Their reactions vary. Some are moved to tears, some are disturbed, unsettled by the sight of a mummified child displayed like a museum artifact. Some take photographs, despite the signs requesting they do not. Some pray, some simply stare, trying to comprehend what they are seeing. Trying to understand what kind of faith, what kind of discipline, what kind of suffering could lead a person to choose this path. The monks who tend the shrine answer questions when asked. They explain the practice. They explain that it is no longer performed. That it was banned in the 19th century when Japan began to modernize, when the government declared such practices barbaric and outlawed them. They explain that Kenshin is one of perhaps 24 Sokushinbutsu that remain in Japan, scattered across temples in the northern mountains. Most are older monks, men in their 50s or 60s when they entered the chamber. Kenshin is the youngest, the only child. This makes him special, more tragic, more profound, more impossible to comprehend. The monks say these things quietly, respectfully. They do not proselytize. They do not ask visitors to believe or to convert. They simply bear witness. They maintain the shrine. They keep the story alive, because that is what Kenshin has become. A story, a legend, a reminder of a time when faith was measured not in words, but in willingness to suffer absolutely, to surrender everything, to transform the body itself into proof of devotion. Sometimes visitors ask if Kenshin was happy, if he chose this path willingly or was coerced somehow by the older monks. The monks who tend the shrine say that there is no way to know, that the records from 700 years ago are incomplete, that the inner life of a boy who lived so long ago is unknowable. But they say also that the practice required absolute willingness, that no one could be forced to endure what Kenshin endured, that the suffering was too great, that only someone who genuinely believed, who genuinely desired this transformation, could have survived the process. Whether that belief was healthy or wise or good is a question each visitor must answer for themselves. The monks do not judge, they do not defend or condemn, they simply maintain the shrine and honour the memory of the boy who sits inside the glass, silent and still, for 700 years and counting. On certain days, on the anniversary of Kenshin's entry into the chamber, or the opening of it, the temple holds special ceremonies. The monks gather in the shrine, they burn incense, they chant sutras, they make offerings of rice and tea and flowers. Visitors are welcome to attend, to sit quietly in the back of the shrine and observe. The ceremonies are simple, solemn, conducted in the old style. The chanting echoes off the wooden walls. The incense smoke rises and fills the small space with fragrance. And Kenshin sits in his glass case, unchanged, unmoved, perhaps aware of the ceremony, perhaps not. No one knows. No one can know. The boundary between life and death, between consciousness and its absence, is a mystery that not even 700 years of preservation can solve. Outside the shrine, the forest continues its cycles. Trees grow old and fall. New trees rise. The stream flows over stones worn smooth by centuries of water. Moss covers the ancient markers and statues. Birds nest in the eaves of the temple buildings. Seasons turn, snow falls and melts. Cherry blossoms open and scatter. The world changes and changes and changes again. But inside the shrine, nothing changes. Kenshin sits as he sat 700 years ago, his body preserved by the poison he drank, by the starvation he endured, by the isolation and darkness and suffering he chose. He is a monument now, a relic, a testament to faith so absolute it could overcome the fundamental law of decay. Whether that faith was wisdom or madness, whether his suffering had meaning or was meaningless, whether he achieved enlightenment or simply died slowly in the dark, these questions remain unanswered. Perhaps unanswerable, all that is certain is that he endured, that his body did not rot, that he became what he set out to become, Sokushinbutsu, a living Buddha, a boy who mummified himself alive and became eternal. The sun sets over the mountain. The temple bell rings, marking the evening prayers. The monks move through the corridors, silent and calm, carrying out the rituals that have been carried out for centuries. In the shrine, the light fades. The glass case reflects the last rays of sunset, turning the interior golden for a moment before darkness falls. And in that darkness, Kenshin sits, waiting, as he has waited for 700 years, as he will wait for 700 more, or 1,000, or forever. Time has ceased to matter. He has passed beyond it, into a state that is neither life nor death, but something else entirely. Something that humans have no word for, something that exists only in this shrine, in this mountain, in the preserved flesh of a boy who chose the hardest path and walked it all the way to its end. His journey complete, his vow unbroken, his silence absolute and eternal.